Hello and welcome to WWF's Conservation Insider series, bringing you closer to the work that your support of WWF makes possible. My name is Will Gartshore. I'm the Deputy Director for Legislative Affairs here at WWF, and I am honored to be moderating this evening's program. To start, I want to thank you for your generous commitment to our work. Together, we truly are creating a brighter future for wildlife, people, and the planet. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Mariana Panuncio-Feldman, Senior Director for International Climate Cooperation, and Elan Strait, Deputy Director for Policy and Strategy. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Will.
Great to be here.
So today we are here to talk about WWF's work on climate change, and in particular, an exciting new initiative that we've played a central role in launching and leading called We Are Still In. But before we dive into exactly what that is, I want to take us back in time and space for a moment. So picture it, Paris, France, the fall of 2015, where the world came together to sign an historic agreement to work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over time in order to keep global temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees and to work towards an even lower target of 1.5 degrees. Now, that milestone was a major victory for WWF and organizations like us, not least because the U.S. was in the leadership role, along with other countries, notably including China, in pushing to get the Paris Agreement done. And that leadership was pivotal. But even as we celebrated the Paris Agreement, we knew that it was just a starting point and it wasn't enough, and that we needed all countries, including the United States, to ramp up their ambition over time. So fast forward to almost exactly 1 year ago, to the next climate conference, COP22 it was called, which took place in Marrakesh, Morocco. That was the first major opportunity for countries to advance the work they'd agreed to under the Paris Agreement. And the United States has spent the year driving hard to bring that agreement fully into force. And that happened. The agreement came into force just a week before that conference in Marrakesh, Morocco, when enough countries effectively ratified the treaty. Now, Elan, I remember being in a meeting at the White House just before Marrakesh, where we were all planning for that big conference, and you at the time were working for the Obama administration for the National Security Council. And you and the rest of the U.S. climate delegation for the administration were in the room. You laid out a carefully designed plan for how the U.S. government was going to lead the way and help drive the ambition of the world over the next few years so that by 2020, the next sort of big moment in these international climate talks, countries would be willing to commit to even more and to get their commitments even closer to where they needed to be under the Paris Agreement to get to what the science requires, right? And then on November 8th of last year, in the United States, a political earthquake happened. Mariana, both you and I were in Marrakesh, Morocco at the time on November 8th, and we woke up on November 9th and the world had changed. And it was only the second day of a 2-week conference designed to advance the goals of the Paris Agreement with all those countries present. So can you talk about that moment, but also talk a little bit about how WWF came into into Marrakesh, Morocco, and then how we responded when the world changed and all of our expectations were scrambled?
Well, certainly, Paris is a COP that I won't forget, and I thought that Morocco was going to be an important COP, but certainly it became a COP, a conference of the parties, basically when all governments come together, that I will never forget. So we came to that meeting when all of the governments come together once, at the end of the year to ready to celebrate. The Paris Agreement had come into force in less than, almost a year, which was amazing. And there was an intense momentum to get the show on the road, to implement the Paris Agreement, to deliver on the targets that countries had laid out, and as you explained, to lay the foundation to go farther, faster. And then the election results came in. We actually did not sleep much that night as we were tracking the results, and early Morocco time, the results of the election became clear. And given the statements of then candidate Trump, of course, that created, as you said, an earthquake in the climate world because of the concerns that, potentially what the U.S. Federal government would decide with regards to the Paris Agreement. Needless to say, there was tremendous shock in Morocco. Delegates from governments, business representatives, observers, NGOs like ours, everybody was thunderstruck by the results. But very quickly, we had to react. Within 1 hour of us learning about the results, we actually, WWF, together with other civil society groups, held a press conference where we said there is no turning back. We basically have to forge ahead. The goals that Paris laid out are very clear, and we need to keep going, regardless of what the United States decides to do with regards to Paris. We spent the following days encouraging delegates and our peers and talking a lot with journalists to shape the narrative so that the potential despair would not sink in, and instead we could keep the momentum. And the amazing thing was that that switch from shock to determination was spread like wildfire. What we saw was that everybody picked on that message, that we needed to keep going, and there were many others who were interested in doing this. So besides our work, where we sprang into action right away, we saw others wanting to, bring their voices to this moment. And so WWF's partner series and us mobilized 365 companies that basically wanted to tell the incoming administration that the U.S. needed to remain in the Paris Agreement, that we needed to uphold our commitment to Paris and keep implementing, policies that would support lower emissions, and that they were going to keep going. And we were able to time the release, as you might remember, with the speech that Secretary Kerry made, where he said at the time that the U.S. will remain engaged in the Paris Agreement, and this was backed by the statement of 365 companies. And that was had a huge impact on the Marrakesh COP, and it was the start of an unstoppable wave.
Right. And I remember him emphasizing that, countries around the world were embracing clean energy, that we reached a tipping point in terms of renewable energy deployment, solar and wind, and that the statement from these companies that they were on board with a renewable energy future, that momentum was going to continue regardless of what federal policy was going to do. And I think that message was, as you say, really, really key to getting the negotiations back on track.
Absolutely.
So, Elan, you've had an interesting perspective in the past year of global climate politics. As I've hinted at, you started out a year ago with the Obama administration, and then you continued for several weeks in your role under the new Trump administration. And then in the early spring of this past year, you came over to WWF to become a panda. And so in those intervening months between Obama and Panda, that was the period, I think, where we were all a little bit on pins and needles because we didn't actually know what the administration was going to do about Paris. I mean, clearly, Donald Trump, throughout the campaign, had made it a key promise that we were going to rip up the Paris Agreement, right? But after taking office in the inauguration, it became clear that maybe it wasn't so cut and dry, and that there were sort of countervailing forces potentially pulling for the U.S. to stay in, maybe just on paper, or maybe to withdraw entirely. So since your first day here at WWF, you've kind of been in the middle of efforts of our organization, working with others to respond to both that uncertainty. I feel like there were half a dozen times when we thought the decision was definitely coming this week, and then for some reason it didn't. And then when it finally did come back in May, marshaling our forces to respond to that moment. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Will. I think this is actually a really interesting story, the way that this happened, and I want to take a step back to the time that Mariana was describing in Marrakesh and talk a little bit about what it was like on the other side. And I'm particularly fascinated by the story because it involves me, but also I got to be involved at some critical moments along the way. And so my original background was that I was a negotiator for the United States on the Paris Agreement. So I was one of the lead negotiators in Paris, writing the transparency elements of the agreement. And then I went to go work at the White House, and our job was to push the agreement into force. And our objective was to do it before November of 2016, and that was a huge task because most agreements take 3 or 4 years to go into force. Kyoto took 4 years. Most international treaties take years to work their way through domestic processes. But there were 2 urgencies that we had. The first was that climate change is an urgent issue, and we don't have a second to delay. We need to get going right away. But the second was a little bit more tactical issue, which is that we didn't know which way the election was going to come out.
Right.
And we wanted to get the agreement into force so that this would be, as you just described, inevitable, that this would be the way the world was going. And so over that year, I worked in the White House to push every other country to finish its domestic process to get the agreement to go in first and into force, and we succeeded. And the agreement went into force on November 4th, 4 days before the election.
Right.
So that's what I was doing, and then the election happened. And I assumed, I think like a lot of people, that I was going to need a new job on January 20th since I was working for the White House. But because I was at the National Security Council, they actually don't want those staffers to leave on January 20th. They don't want to have an entirely new national security staff on January 21st. So they asked me to stay, even though I was working on climate. And I stayed because I thought, well, here's an opportunity to try to shift things in the right direction. So for the first 4 weeks of the administration, I was the senior director for energy. I was head of energy for National Security Council. And then after that, I had a boss from the Trump administration. And our job was basically to run the process on how the administration was going to decide whether or not to stay in Paris. And so for those 4 weeks, the way things kind of worked was that there were 2 sides to this debate, of course. There was withdraw and stay in. On the withdraw side, that was really led by the EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt and Steve Bannon in the White House, who wanted to make sure that they had total freedom to do whatever they wanted to do domestically. And that meant abandoning any sort of international obligation. They wanted to withdraw. On the other side, you had people who wanted to stay in because they had other international objectives, trade objectives, or other diplomacy or military objectives. And then they knew that if they abandoned the climate agreement, that was going to make those objectives harder. And so that was led really by Gary Cohn and Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, who wanted us to stay in. And my job was just to provide them with the information. And when I left in the middle of March, I thought that the administration was going to stay in, which shows what I know. But I thought they were going to stay in because I thought the Rex Tillerson side was going to win. When I came to WWF right after, I still had that confidence, but it quickly became clear that this was actually more 50-50 than I thought. And exactly like you said, Will, there were times when it was like a will they, won't they.
Yeah.
A story would come out that they're definitely going to withdraw. It's going to happen on Friday. It's about to happen, and then nothing would happen. And then they're going to stay in. They're going to announce they're staying in. It's going to happen on Friday, and then nothing would happen. And that went on for a long time. But what we were doing behind the scenes at WWF was using that tool that we had created called Low Carbon USA to get CEOs to call the White House directly, not covered by the press, not to make any statement, but to quietly call the president and say, I'm the CEO of this gigantic corporation. I employ X million people, and it's important to me that you stay in Paris. And we were able to get 10 to 15 CEOs to call the president. Which shows 2 things. The first is that business lever is really important in this debate. And the second thing is that these statements aren't just statements, that they're actual tools that groups like us can rely on to go back to those people that signed the statement and say, you signed the statement, you said you cared, here's what we need you to do. And that happened. That happened and was able to delay the decision. Now, it wasn't able to come out correctly in the end. The administration announced that they were withdrawing, but we were able to get them to think about it for a little bit longer. Meanwhile, we were also doing another thing, which was preparing for an outcome. So we knew that if it was going to go the wrong way, that we wanted to be prepared to show exactly the message internationally, Mariana, that you just talked about, which is that I know the federal government is out, but members of the real economy are still in. And we wanted cities and states and businesses and universities, the members of the real economy who actually make employment or construction or whatever decisions, that they were going to try to uphold the Paris Agreement. And so over the course of 72 hours, from the time that the president announced that they were going to withdraw to the next Monday, we were able to get 1,200 cities, states, businesses, universities to sign on to this statement called We Are Still In, saying that they were going to try to uphold the Paris Agreement. And since then, the numbers have only grown, and we actually have a video that sort of tells this story, this narrative arc that we'll show right now. So as you can see from that video, that really tells the emotional story of the high of Paris to the low of the announcement to now a new high, just like you said, Mariana, of determination to move forward. And if you want more information, we just launched a website recently called wearestillin.com that you can check out more. And what this website will tell you is that when we launched with 1,200, but now we have over 2,500. And this thing has continued its momentum to today. And you can check out more about that at the website and see all the great businesses and cities and states and universities that have signed up for it.
Thanks, that's great. So Mariana, as Elan alluded to, while this is a U.S.-based initiative with U.S. actors, the audience really is the rest of the world in a way. I think this slogan of "We are still in," if I'm thinking back, I think it really originated back in Marrakesh, Morocco. And I think here we have a picture of, so this is the "We are still in" slogan painted on a banner that's being held by representatives from US-based NGOs who wanted to send a message at that time to their international counterparts at the negotiations and to the government negotiators that regardless of the US decision after the election, the people of the United States still stood behind the Paris Agreement. And you may recognize the guy in the sunglasses in front as your friendly moderator for this evening. But now a year later from that moment, "We Are Still In" has gone from being a banner painted by a few dozen U.S. climate advocates to a banner that over 2,000 American businesses and cities and states and universities are rallying around. But that message is still the same at its heart, right? It's still directed at the rest of the world. So as we head into the next big climate meeting, what we call COP23, which is happening in Bonn, Germany, but is actually hosted by Fiji, I should point out. But will be starting up next week. I think we're all getting ready to jump on planes in the next few days. Talk about why this message of "We are still in" matters in that moment. Why is it important for the world to know that regardless of what the Trump administration does at all other levels, the U.S. is still in?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing that I wanted to reiterate is what you said, that the world heard us. When "We Are Still In" was launched, there were immediate responses from around the world, and hopefully now we'll be able to see a tweet that the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Patricia Espinosa, did right after the "We Are Still In" was launched, that basically reiterated the important and fundamental role that cities, states, businesses, and other groups play in the transformation that we are in the midst of, and basically recognize the importance of the U.S. coalition that had just been born. Going back to your question, 1 year later, we faced the same challenges that we faced in Morocco, but made all the more pressing by the decision of the U.S. federal government to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and dismantle the policy framework in the U.S. that underpins, at least federally supported climate action. So first, the national pledges that were made by governments in 2015 are not sufficient to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. The United Nations Environment Program releases every year a report called the Emissions Gap Report. And basically that report aims to document the disparity between the world's stated ambitions and the actions that are really taking place. And basically what that report shows is that those pledges are still way off. We know that if they were fully implemented, they would only contribute 1/3 of the required emissions to deliver on keeping the global temperature increase below 2 degrees. countries. Governments knew this when they signed the Paris Agreement, and that is why they created what is called a ratchet cycle, basically a 5-year cycle that would allow governments to put subsequently stronger targets so that over time we could close that emissions gap and actually achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. The first test of that cycle is now. Basically, between now and 2020, we have the opportunity to revise those targets that were put in place in 2015 and to make them stronger. And we need countries to do that. The second challenge that we faced 1 year ago and we face now is that the strength of the Paris Agreement relies on the implementation guidelines. Basically, these guidelines are really important because they will ensure that countries are transparent with each other, that they are accountable to each other, and that is fundamental to build trust so that we can go farther, faster together. These rules need to be developed in the next year. So governments agreed that by the end of 2018, those implementation guidelines will be completed. And at this time, given that, as Elan said, climate change, we have no time to lose on this, the delegates cannot falter. So the reassurance that this U.S. coalition of states, cities, universities, and businesses, the reassurance that they are providing that the real agents of the American economy are still in is fundamental, crucial to give the rest of the world, the governments and other actors, the confidence and the courage to implement the targets that they set for themselves, to surpass them, to increase their ambition, and to put together this strong guidelines that would allow basically the architecture of the Paris Agreement to be delivered. And I think it's also important to highlight that this coalition also helps embolden other companies, businesses, cities, and states around the world to support climate action too. In fact, WWF is working right now to help support national coalitions in other countries around the world so that we can, these coalitions, these domestic constituencies for climate action can work with their governments that still own the Paris Agreement and are committed to it, to really deliver on their targets as a collective enterprise. So we think that this is a crucial time, and with our presence with 100 countries, 100 offices around the world, I think that we can make an important contribution to this.
Yeah, no, it's great. The example that the U.S. has set, sort of, multiplying around the world from the ground up, which is amazing. So, of course, all the reassurances, to the world that we are still in is giving won't ultimately add up to much if there isn't sort of concrete action here at home as well, right? And so I know that these are other objectives of this initiative, which Elan, I'll ask you to speak to, about how we are still in is kind of harnessing these commitments and this energy of these subnational actors to both actually achieve real emissions reductions here in the U.S., but also to sort of change the conversation in a way so that politically we can get back on track in terms of federal policy as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this coalition is about actually making a difference. It's not just words on a paper, and I think the best place to start is by looking at the numbers that you see up in front of you for the coalition to understand what its makeup is. And so a few things that I want to point out. The first is that the number you see in front of you this is growing so fast that it's actually already out of date. And since we made this slide, we've added an entire new sector to our coalition. There are 200 faith groups, so 200 congregations around the country that have also joined We Are Still In. That happened this week, and that's really important in terms of making a political movement. That's sort of an unusual voice that you don't always get in a climate debate. The other thing I want to point out is that if you look at the states and cities that we have, they represent over 130 million Americans, and they have $6 trillion in GDP, and that actually makes those cities and states the third largest country in the world.
Wow.
So it's a major power on its own right. And then the other thing is that if you look at the businesses, so it's over 1,700 businesses, and that's nearly 5 million employees. And the reason that's so important is that because a lot of times this debate gets down to job creation or job killing, and when we hear people who don't care about climate action, who want to slow down the progress, what they point to is 50,000 coal miner jobs. And so it's important to recognize that those are really important jobs, and that we need to take care of people who otherwise wouldn't be part of a transition to a clean energy economy.
Right.
But when you're making a policy decision, you have to compare those 50,000 jobs to the 5 million jobs of companies that do care about climate action, and that how much bigger that force is in this debate. I also want to talk about, going forward, what we're going to do with this coalition. And so we've identified 3 objectives for the next year that we want that this coalition will undertake. The first is that coalition that I just showed you, the 2,400 signatories, we actually have signatories in all 50 states. And so we have local leaders around the country that want to uphold the Paris Agreement. And our first objective is to get them to speak out more and do local events or talk to their local newspaper about why they care about climate action. And the more we can do that, the more we can take this debate out of what's a pretty toxic political debate in Washington and get it out to the rest of the country where it's less of a toxic discussion. It's more about, do you care about clean energy? Of course. Do you care about clean air? Of course. And it's less hostile. And I think one of the other interesting things is that when we launched We Are Still In, it wasn't just the New York Times and Washington Post that was reporting on the launch. It actually got coverage in the Richmond paper, in the Charlotte paper, in the Minneapolis paper, and it really broke through in local communities. We'd like to see more of that. Objective 2 is, just as Mariana is describing, is getting that reassurance projected internationally also, that there are 2,500 now actors who care about upholding the Paris Agreement. And what we're doing most immediately is in a week at the next gathering of countries for the climate negotiations is we're actually going to have a center where we're going to have 100 American local leaders, mayors and business leaders and governors and university leaders who will talk to the international community about what they're doing at home. And this is the first time this has ever been done. The climate negotiations often have federal government centers, and they often have centers from NGOs and from other people, but there's never been a center for the subnational voice, for cities and states, and we're taking this opportunity to do something that's never been done before, and that's what's going to happen at next week. It's called the U.S. Climate Action Center, and we're organizing that with Climate Nexus and Ceres, and it's really exciting and historic achievement. The third objective is, like you just said, Will, like none of this really matters unless we're actually going to drive down emissions at the end of the day. And so how do we get from where we are to where we need to be? So one of the things that's happening next week is there'll be a release of a report called America's Pledge, which is an effort by Mike Bloomberg and Governor Jerry Brown to show a pathway from where we are in terms of the emissions in the United States to where we need to be that doesn't rely on federal action. Can we hit the U.S. target under Paris without the federal government? Can we do it alone with city and state and business action? And so that release is happening at the U.S. Climate Action Center. And what we're going to do next year is engage in a campaign to get these 2,500 signatories to do what they need to do, and all of whom want to do this, to do what they need to do to get us from where we are to where we need to be.
That's great. No, it's just a really powerful initiative, I think. So as much as I'm enjoying this conversation, I would like to open up the floor to our friends who have joined us for the evening and have questions. So I will cede the floor to them. And we will start today with a question from the web. So this is coming from Brent in Oregon. Aside from supporting WWF financially, what else can I do to support these climate efforts?
So that's a great question, and I think there's a lot of great stuff that you can do in this effort. But before we blow past the what can I do besides supporting financially, I just want to mention that WWF is engaged in these things at a level and scale that has actually never been done before.
Right.
And if we're gonna be able to keep doing what we're doing, launching not only We're Still In, which is the largest coalition in U.S. history for climate action, but launching them around the world, which is a necessary condition of fulfilling the Paris Agreement, we will need resources. So before we move past that, I just wanted to mention it.
Well
but there's also three things in addition that you can do, those of you watching. The first is that there's something called I Am Still In, which is sort of a sister effort to We're Still In, and you can check that out right in front of you. You see worldwildlife.org/IamStillIn2017, and that's a pledge that you can sign yourself that not only says that you support the goals of the Paris Agreement, but it actually includes 3 pledges of things you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. And that makes it a really cool way for you to be part of this effort and contribute. The second thing is that we'll also circulate a toolkit for folks who are interested to reach out to their mayor, to their governor, to local businesses in their community, to the university that they went to or their kids went to or are going to, and encourage them to sign on to We're Still In. And we'll give you all the materials you need to do that right after this, so that you can send a letter or send a tweet or send an email and encourage others to sign up. And the third thing you can do is that you yourself can just tweet or Facebook or Snapchat or whatever you do in support of this movement and raise awareness of it. So we'll give you all the tools you need to do that, but those are the three things that you can do from home.
Great, and I'll just toss in a fourth thing that you can do as well, which is vote for climate action.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we need to change the conversation at the federal level as well as the state and local level as well. So when you're considering how you're using your ballot, think about support for climate action. So the next question we have is from the phones, and it is from Emily in Ohio. If the federal government decides it's not going to invest in climate action, what difference can this coalition really make?
That's a great question, and I think there's two answers. The first is I don't want to blow past how upsetting this is. We're talking about this incredible coalition of actors that have come together, but it is super unfortunate that that this is necessary. And if we're ever going to get to a place in 2050 or in 2060 where we've completely transitioned to a clean energy economy, where we have electric vehicles and renewable energy, then eventually the federal government really does need to step up. But in the meantime, it's important to note that actually this is sort of how decision-making works in the United States. The Clean Power Plan, which was President Obama's regulation to reduce emissions, required each state to set a target for energy efficiency. So at the end of the day, even under the previous administration, states had to step up and undertake actions to reduce emissions. And so what we're doing with this coalition is not that out of the ordinary for the United States. A lot of decision-making is decentralized, and we're just trying to bypass that step where the federal government tells states what to do and get states to do it themselves voluntarily because it's the right thing to do.
Great. So I will go to the next question if we have any others. Oh, here we go. Yes. So this one is from Eric in Washington State. So yesterday, Scott Pruitt, who's the EPA administrator, said that any scientist who receives EPA grant money can no longer serve on the advisory board. Is WWF able to fill that gap? It's an interesting question.
It is interesting. I also don't want to dismiss that. One of the really important roles that the federal government has had historically, and the U.S. more than any other country in the world, is climate research, and that is unfortunately going away under this administration. A lot of that is through research dollars. A lot of that is through agencies in the federal government. I don't think any one organization can pick up that gap. But I think that's part of what's so great about the We're Still In Coalition is it has universities involved. And you do see a lot of universities stepping up to the plate and announcing that they're going to do these things that they used to get paid by the federal government to do, but now they're going to do anyway. And in fact, one of the announcements, this is a spoiler alert, one of the announcements you might see at the COP in a couple weeks is that University of California is going to be bringing together a number of universities to launch this kind of initiative where they're going to increase what they're doing on research to try to fill that gap. So they're going to announce that. Act surprised when you see it. Don't tell them I told you in advance. But that is the kind of thing that's going to help fill that important gap too.
And I think on these advisory councils, I mean, obviously climate change isn't the only one. In fact, our CEO, Carter Roberts, has been on a couple of these advisory councils on environmental issues. And I think that can be a challenge because the administration needs to be looking for that advice for us to be able to participate in that. But we certainly will continue to communicate our point of view as best we can through other channels. So the next question is from Jeff in Wisconsin. Are there any WWF initiatives to encourage their members to move towards alternative energy sources and help fuel momentum towards these types of solutions? I will just toss out one and then throw it to you guys, which is that we did run a campaign maybe 4 years ago now, Renewable, It's Doable.
I still have my T-shirt.
Yeah, they're great T-shirts, which was specifically focused on rooftop solar. And it was all about communicating, how easy it was to actually put solar panels on your roof, especially in states that had the kind of leasing arrangements and the kind of aggregators where you could go and find out how to do it cheaply and efficiently. So we have launched entire campaigns around this in the past, but I'll toss it to you guys if you want to mention other initiatives that we might have in the works.
Maybe not right now an existing initiative of sorts, but I think that, Elan, you were describing where the We Are Still In coalition is going, and part of this is really landing in very specific specific localities. And so I think that it will be fantastic if our members can engage, in those conversations at the state level as businesses and cities and state governments are trying to find ways of working together to accelerate climate action in specific localities, how that can be, how can address the demands such as the one stated by the caller. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that, but I think that there is a rich opportunity for us to ground this effort and really pick up on those ideas and materialize them.
Yeah, I love the question from the caller, and I think there is this marriage of things that we could do and should do more of, which is there are a number of states or cities that allow purchaser of electricity, so any resident, to decide whether they want to get renewable energy instead. In some places it costs more, in some places it doesn't, but you check a little box on your electricity bill and you say, I want renewable energy. And so we could do a couple of things there. The first is try to get more states to offer those programs, to allow residents to choose. And the second is, just as the caller suggested, run a campaign where we encourage our members to make that decision.
Right, and then above the individual level, of course, we have a whole ton of work going on at the corporate level,
Right.
outside of just the We Are Still In coalition.
Right.
We have something called the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, and so working with big purchasers of renewable energy at the corporate level to get them to actually demand more renewable energy in the supply so that they can power their business with renewable energy.
Exactly.
So there's actually a lot going on.
Yeah.
So this has been a great conversation, but I think it's probably time that we wrap things up. So on behalf of WWF, thank you so much for joining us and for supporting our efforts to protect the future of nature and all living things. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you. Thank you.